Hello and welcome to the Certified Information Systems Auditing or CISA class. My name is Chris Thorson and we're going to be going over what you need to know to prepare for the CISA exam. If you come from a technology background like I do, it's not just about port scanning and looking for open passwords and things like that. Instead, it is a much broader topic. So we're going to be covering things like the audit process itself and IT governance. We'll also talk about the system and infrastructure lifecycle maintenance and management. We'll talk about IT service delivery and support and protecting information assets and a little bit of business continuity and disaster recovery. So why don't we get going and start on our preparation for the CISA exam. All right, let's get started in our studies on CISA. Let's first talk about the process. When you do an audit, there is a whole process, and in order to take the exam, they expect you to know this process. They don't expect you to know this particular pen test tool or that particular methodology, because when you do IS auditing, the field is so broad, so vast, that you can cover anything from the nuclear industry to health informatics, which is my background. Instead, we're going to be focusing on the general process, which can apply to then any industry or any type of audit situation. Before we get going, I'd really like to share with you a couple of things to impress upon you the seriousness of cybersecurity. Let's first take a look at a document here. This is from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and it was recently published. And PricewaterhouseCoopers is a big audit firm, and they do IS auditing, IT auditing, as well as financial auditing. And you'll notice they talk about 10 minutes on the stark realities of cybersecurity. More than just an IT challenge, it's a business imperative. And as we talk about certified IS auditor, we need to think not just as technologists, not just I'm looking for buffer overflows or I'm looking for open ports, but we need to look at a much broader sort of range here. We need to look at, are people doing what they're supposed to be doing? And do they even know what they're supposed to be doing? As we go through this class, we're going to talk about how do we approach making sure that there is some kind of procedure in place, and are they adhering to it, and how do we report it, and how do we handle irregularities and even management trying to conceal things. Like I said, this is a very broad topic. You're not expected to know specific little tools or exact standards or procedures, but you are expected to know that they exist and how they fit in the overall framework. I'd like to share with you another thing. If we go to SANS.org and we go down to the 20 critical security controls here, we can see that, okay, inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices, wireless device control, data recovery, malware defense, boundary defense, data loss, incident response. Yes, these are the topics that we're very comfortable with as technologists. We need to, as the auditor, look beyond that. We need to see, okay, is there even some kind of control or procedure in place? So this is what we're going to be focusing on. Why don't we get going on talking about the audit process? Starting out with, we're going to talk about what ACCA is all about. An ACCA is actually an acronym that they use now. It used to actually stand for something longer. Get to that in a moment. We'll talk about developing and implementing an audit strategy and how you plan for and conduct an audit. However, again, because this can be everything from automotive to government, there are no specific individual one-size-fit-all plans. However, there are many recommendations, standards, and guidelines and procedures and tools that we're going to take a quick look at on the ACCA site. We'll talk about conducting that audit, like I said. We'll talk about also evidence life cycle and how do you maintain evidence and how do you make sure the evidence is relevant and it's good. And we'll talk about communicating issues and risks, and we'll talk about supporting the implementation of risk management and control practices. So let's talk about ACCA. And this is the term ACCA is now, they call themselves by that only, the acronym only, but it used to stand for the Information System Audit Control Association. They don't use that whole big name anymore. If we go to ACCA's site, we can familiarize ourselves a little bit with them. We can see this is ACCA's site. You can become an ACCA member. There's over 100,000 members in almost all countries in the world. And their whole idea when they started out was there were similar people who did a similar job of trying to figure out, are we in compliance? And they got together and they said, okay, what is it that we all have in common? And can we come up with some standards, some global standards that can be adopted in any situation? Now, as we look through these topics here, granted, they are aimed at much larger organizations, but you can pare down the concepts even to smaller organizations. You just don't have to maybe think in terms of many, many departments and people, but the principles still apply regardless of whatever. So we can see the ACCA site here, and one of the first things that they talk about is this concept of the Code of Ethics. And as a CISA, you are required to uphold the professional code of ethics. And basically, it's about how you conduct yourself, how you protect your client's assets, and how you do your audit and how you report your findings. So this code of ethics, it guides our conduct as professionals and also in a personal way when we conduct our audit. And we're all required to follow the guidelines, and we must perform tasks that adhere to the Code of Ethics. And if we actually go take a look at ACCA's Code of Ethics right here, we can see that they require us to, and you'll need to at least know the gist of this, support the implementation of and encourage compliance with appropriate standards. And ACCA was all about standards. We're going to take a quick look at some of the standards in a moment. Perform duties with objectivity and due diligence. The idea is that we do everything that is reasonably possible. We are diligent, and we do everything that is reasonable to discover and report any irregularities when we do our audit. And we maintain privacy and confidentiality. And we only communicate our findings to appropriate persons. And we maintain our own competency. The ACCA group, when you get your CISA, requires that you maintain your certification by getting regular continuing education. And that we inform appropriate parties. So we don't just go telling anybody about what we discover, only the appropriate parties. And we try to educate all the stakeholders involved. So we want to professionally educate not just the managers we're working with, but upper management as well as the workers, so that everybody understands, all stakeholders, they understand their role in information security. When we talk about auditing, auditing is not, like I said, just scanning for open ports, looking for default passwords, services that need to be shut down. It is about looking at whole processes. How do you guys actually do this? I mean, if you're creating this, how do you go from here to here in every process that you go through to get to here? In larger organizations, they have established processes, and these are processes that have worked for them for a very long time. And a good organization that's doing its own due diligence will have established standards and procedures. There are also, depending on the type of industry, lots of regulatory requirements. And as an auditor, we need to understand, first of all, well, how is it that you guys do things? How is it that you want to do things? What's your best practice? Now, what's the industry best practice? What are any government regulations? So you can see that if you're an auditor, you need to know, first of all, the industry you're working in. And you need to understand the process of this particular business that you're looking at. And I assure you, you're not going to be doing it alone. You'll be part of a larger team, and you'll be doing things that work with your own particular skill set. So it's all process and procedure. What are your procedures? Are you guys actually washing your hands before preparing food kind of thing? Are you actually locking desktops before you leave your workstation? Are you actually closing server doors? Do you actually have a guard there watching cameras? I mean, what is your procedure? And now, are you adhering to it? Then also, not only that, but what is the actual organization itself? Are there any gaps in the way the organization is set up? As well as job functions. So we're going to be auditing how people, individuals do their jobs. And we're not trying to come down on them like the cops or anything. We're trying to help organizations determine, are they on target? Because really, as PricewaterhouseCoopers pointed out in their other document, if you don't have a secure environment in terms of your data and your systems, you don't have much of a business. So we're helping them do that. And then, of course, we're also looking at systems. We're looking at databases. We're looking at networks. We're looking at firewalls. We're looking at the more technical aspects of their systems. So when we do auditing, it's called a function. It's an audit function. And we don't just go charging in there. We spend some time planning, really understanding what it is that we're supposed to do. And then, of course, we perform our audit. We organize our report. We report it to the appropriate parties. And also we manage, we come back and say, okay, I recommended that within 6 months you should have done ABC. Let me see if you've done it. So we do a follow-up. Did you guys follow up on the recommendations? And then also, of course, we use standards and legal requirements to do our auditing. The next thing we're going to do is actually go to ACCA's site and look at some of their standards. Again, you don't need to memorize them, but you should be aware of them, and you should be aware of how they relate to the job of the CISA. Let's go take a look at ACCA's published standards. Now again, you're not expected to memorize these, but you are expected to know them in general and how they relate to the whole IS audit process. While we're looking at standards, we'll also look at some of the published guidelines and procedures. We'll even drill down a little bit, take a look at some tools. You're not expected to know the tools at all, but you are expected to understand the technology behind these tools and why these tools are chosen. So let's actually go to ACCA's website. And here's ACCA's website, and you can join, but there's a lot of stuff you can do without having to be a member of ACCA. And if we go up to the Knowledge Center up here, we can take a look right now at the standards. And this is a very, very handy page to take a look at. So we're going to take a look at the standards. When you're auditing, this is what I do. I have these standards handy sort of as a checklist, and depending upon what I'm auditing, I'm planning, and I'm working with a team. It's not just myself. And we're figuring out our strategy. Okay, it's this particular type of business. It's this. They have these constraints and these kinds of conditions. And I just look at our plan and our strategy and everything we do, and I just double check it against the standards, sort of as a checklist. Are we still in compliance? And the whole reason why is so that we can maintain the highest level of standard and integrity. And that was the whole idea behind ACCA. Let's try to have standards and guidelines that work in any situation, and people can always look to them and adhere to them to the best of their ability so that we're producing the best service, the best product. So when we look down here, we can see the IT audit and assurance standards, and there's actually a link down here. And they talk about the goal is to advance globally applicable standards, advance globally applicable standards that address the specialized nature of IT. And if we click more about standards, guidelines, tools, and techniques, it'll take us to where we can look at standards first. And here's something you do need to know. Standards are mandatory. You must adhere to standards. Whereas guidelines, they provide guidance and additional information. They're not mandatory, but they help you stay on track. And then there are specific tools and techniques. Let's actually look at the standards. Now, of course, they had the whole thing about the Code of Professional Ethics, but let's actually take a look at some of the standards. We're going to view the standards right here. And we can see that the standards are published in a bunch of different languages. We're going to go to the English version right here. And notice that there are many standards, and they all start with an S in front of the numbers. So there are 16 standards, starting with S, starting with the idea of having a charter for the audit. We're going to click the charter for the audit. And there's a little introduction and then what the standard itself is. And we can see for standard number 1, purpose, responsibility, authority, and accountability of the IS audit function, meaning the audit that you're going to do, or the IS audit assignment should be documented in a charter or engagement letter. In other words, I should have a document that says, why are we doing this? Who's responsible? On whose authority are we doing this? Because let me tell you, you need absolute upper management authority saying you can do this, because you're going to run into all kinds of resistance down in the lower departments. And who's accountable for all this? This should be clearly written down. So that's our first standard. Have a documented thing saying why we're doing it, who's responsible. So our very first thing, the idea of the audit charter. Going on to independence, the next thing here. In all matters related to the audit, you're independent. You do not answer to the people you're auditing. You don't even answer to the people who hired you, except to give them the report. You are completely independent of who you're auditing in attitude and appearance. So that's your second standard. Next one, professional ethics and standards. And then, of course, now, as a CISA, as an ACCA auditor, we are going to adhere to that code of professional ethics that we looked at a little bit earlier. And we will exercise, and this really means exercising due professional care, including observing all applicable standards. We're going to do our very best and do due care, be complete, thorough, methodical. Our next standard, professional competence. We should be professionally competent for what we're actually auditing. Like I said, when you're auditing something large, you'll be part of a team, and you should be assigned to audit something that is within your realm of skills, your particular professional competence. Do not attempt to do things that are outside your realm of competence. I mean, because you're doing yourself and everyone else a disservice. That's why we have a team. Different people have different skill sets. So you should also maintain and improve your professional competence through continuing training and education. Going on to planning. We should plan this whole thing. We just don't go charging in there. We actually plan how are we going to do it, including the objectives, and this complies with any laws and also our professional standards. And here's a big one right here. We should develop and document a risk-based audit approach. We'll talk more about risk-based, but in short, risk-based means we start by identifying potential risks and we figure out, okay, what is being done to mitigate those risks? Is anything being done to mitigate those risks? And the risks are not just to the system or the process or the people that we're auditing, but also to our own audit process itself. And we'll come back to risk-based auditing in a bit. Then we go ahead and we do the audit. We perform the work. And supervision, IS audit staff should be supervised to provide reasonable assurance that objectives are met. In other words, there will be a lead, and that lead will make sure that every person is doing what they're supposed to do in their part of the audit. Then reporting. We'll provide an appropriate report. And generally it starts with an executive summary and then it can drill down farther and farther. But we provide a report because ultimately we want to give people some actionable item, some report they can look at that they can quickly understand, and then they can go deeper and deeper as they need to. So we provide a report to the appropriate parties in a format that's appropriate for them as well. And so we'll see the report will state our scope and our objective. what our findings and conclusions are. We'll also be open about what our limits were, and also we'll point to the fact that we gathered specific evidence, and we'll point to the evidence in our report. Then we're not done as auditors when we just say, here's the report, thanks, see ya. We come back. I mean, we have recommendations. We work with the managers. We work with the managers and we say, look, we found that you guys were doing this and this. This and this happened, and it happened a bunch of times, and we traced it back because folks were doing it this way. We're not like saying you're bad. That's not the point. We're helping them be compliant so that they can run their business in the best possible way. So our whole thing is we come back and we say, okay, we gave you about 6 months to try to correct this. And then we do a follow-up. Did they follow up on our recommendations or our requirements? So we come and we say, all right, we should request and evaluate relevant information to conclude whether appropriate action has been taken in a timely manner. What's the point of an audit if you don't act on it, right? And then irregularities and illegal acts, and this is a sensitive issue here. When you do an audit, chances are good that you'll run into people who tried to hide things, who tried to conceal things. And it may not be necessarily fraudulent, but they knew they were kind of cutting corners or skimping or not following procedure. And you'll find even senior management sometimes tries to hide things, tries to hide fraudulent activity. And so you need to realize that there's a good possibility you'll run into this. You should consider the risk of irregularities and illegal acts. But when you go in there, you have this sort of attitude of what they call professional skepticism, where you just go, I need to see first. You don't just trust them right off the bat. I mean, you're there not to trust. You're there to find out fact. And you realize that upper management may be trying to hide stuff, or lower management or workers may be trying to hide stuff. And this is where your professionalism comes in. You're not there to judge. You're there to gather evidence and form an opinion and make recommendations. And further on, talking about IT governance. And the idea is whether or not, and this is a biggie, you know, I remember as a technologist, I started out as a system administrator, and back in those days, and this was like 10, 15 years ago, the whole world for IT people revolved around what we were doing. And what we didn't realize was that we were just part of a bigger business. And ACCA recognizes that when we do auditing, how IT is conducted must not just be something unto itself. The whole purpose of IT is to make the business work. The whole reason why we as IT technologists, why we do anything, is so that the people who actually make the money can do their job and can do it effectively. So the management of IT, the governance of IT governance must align to the organization's mission and vision. We don't just have firewalls because we like it. We don't have this particular operating system because it's cool. It's because it supports completely the organization's mission and vision and objectives and strategies. So we need to make sure that IS functions actually do that, and they're governed to do that. Then we also talk about risk assessment. So when we do our audit, we do it as a risk approach. What are the risks? And like I said, we'll talk more about risk approach to auditing in a little bit. But we're going to be looking for risks, and we're going to see, are there any controls in place to mitigate those risks? When we collect evidence, audit materiality is this substantial? You ever hear the term, oh, that's not material, or material evidence, it's immaterial? We're looking for stuff that has substance, that really has any meaning, that has any, it actually will hurt the business, or it will hurt the the IS process. So we're looking for something that actually has some substance to it, materiality. Also, using the work of other experts. Highly recommended you consider using the work of other experts who came before you. You should also judge whether or not that work was actually substantial and adequate. Going further on, as we gather evidence, there is a whole way of maintaining evidence. We need to get sufficient and appropriate evidence, and we need to maintain it in a way that we can always account for from A to Z, from the beginning to right now. Were there any lapses in the control of that evidence and the chain of the ownership? More on evidence in a bit. And then we need to look at, for IT controls, what controls do the organization have in place? What controls do they have in place to try to reduce, mitigate risk? So do they have any controls? And we'll talk a whole lot more about controls in a bit. And then finally, trying to make sure that since so much business now is e-commerce, are there applicable controls for the e-commerce operations of that organization? And are the e-commerce transactions properly controlled? So those are the ACCA standards. Again, you don't need to memorize, but you need to know they exist and you need to know them in general. The next thing we're going to take a look at are the guidelines and the procedures. We've looked at standards. Let's go take a look at guidelines and procedures, because it's all very well to talk about, well, you need to adhere to standards, there are guidelines, but we should actually take a look. Again, you don't need to memorize these, but you need to know that they're there, and when you're actually in the field, you need to refer to these constantly. So we're going to take a look at guidelines, which will guide us. Again, guidelines are not required, but they help us when we do our audit, and they help us adhere to standards. We'll also look at procedures. And just like with the standards that start with an S, guidelines start with a G, and procedures start with a P. And so there are many specific methods that align with the standards for risk assessment, digital signatures, intrusion detection, antivirus, firewalls, irregularities. Why don't we go take a look actually at ACCA's site? So here is the guidelines page in ACCA. And you can see it starts with a G, and you can see that some of these guidelines were withdrawn recently and have been replaced by some others. Now, I have to warn you that if you want to see some of this stuff, you actually have to join ACCA. And you can join them, and there's like a local chapter in your area. The dues aren't too bad. They're like, depending upon where you are, like in LA, they're like $25 for like twice a year. So it's not bad at all. But some of the stuff you have to actually join if you're going to join professional membership. There's also the reduced cost student membership as well. So we're just going to take a look at some of these so that you can see these guidelines. Like for example, audit evidence requirement. Let's just click this one here, G2. And when I go down here, the first thing they do is they talk about, and you can download the PDF if you want. We're just going to scroll the website. They show actually how it links to the standards like standard S6 or S9. So in linking to standard S6, this guideline, performance of audit work, during the course of the audit, the auditor should obtain sufficient, reliable, and relevant evidence. So they show how the guideline relates directly to the standard, and they show all the other standards that this relates to. They also talk about its linkage to something called COBIT, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Talk about why we need the guideline, and as you're planning, how this guideline helps you. So remember how we talked about how so much of auditing is first really planning. Here's the thing. You want to plan so that you know exactly what to go in and do. You realize your audit will disrupt the business that you're auditing. So you want to go in and be at their convenience as much as possible. I mean, if they're trying to hide stuff from you, you have to detect that, but you're trying to not disrupt them if you can help it. And that's why planning is so crucial, so that you just know exactly what to go and do, and we're out of their hair. And but we can gather the evidence we need, and we can have an informed opinion. So for the planning, the types of audit evidence. And so we should take into account the type of evidence that's gathered. And so also, is the evidence the things to be considered is the independence and qualifications of the provider. So like the person who's giving us evidence, are they feeding us something only they want us to see? You know, they don't want us to see the real thing, or are they independent? So how good is the source of the evidence, and how reliable is the source of the evidence? And we should consider testing whether controls have been completed and attested by an independent third party. You go there with professional skepticism. You don't just automatically believe. And the more that you can get it from an independent third party, that, yeah, this is how it's done, or this is the real, the real data, that's better. And so now, looking for types of audit evidence, let's look at 214. Observed processes and existence of physical items. You say it exists. Does it really? Show me. Can I see where it is? Documentary audit evidence and representations and analysis. So then I can look here and I can see that physical items could be inventory of media or a computer room security system. Notice that these things are very, very broad. Like I said, it's because we're covering any possible industry, any possible business. So you have to fill in the blanks, but use these always as your checklist. And then, okay, for documentary audit evidence, can I see your transactions? Can I see your invoices? Can I see your logs? Can I actually see documentation of activity? And then also representations of those being audited. Okay, you say that you have a system in place. May I see your policy? May I see your written procedure? You say you do it this way. May I see the procedure that you have and see how it's really happening? Let me tell you a story. So I was at this one center, and basically I noticed that upper management simply sent an email around saying, you need to be in compliance, so go to this website and take this little training. And that will put you in compliance for the level of education. And so I turned to the receptionist and I said, hey, Nini, do you know about that email? And she said, what email? So we have to actually see, okay, I could go to upper management and they could say, we've got training in place. And everyone takes the training. But when you really get down to it, it's like, did you see about that email that said go to that site and get the training? So you have to actually see. It's one thing for management to say they got something. It's a whole other thing to see what's really going on. And I'm not saying that management will necessarily try to hide stuff from you. They won't, but they think things are okay. You got to go down, right down to the bottom there and verify. You have to verify for yourself and document that, hey, yeah, everybody did get the email, everybody did go, everybody did take that little training, everybody did digitally sign something. Now, also when they talk about availability of evidence, they say realize if you want to see transactions and logs and invoices, that stuff may not always be available just snapping your fingers. They may have to drag it out of storage. It may only be available at certain times because they're using it something. So you have to be sensitive to that and work with them and work ahead of time with them so they can make that stuff available to you. And then when you look at it, they talk about selection of evidence, the nature of evidence. So when you gather your evidence here, the following procedures should be considered. You inquire, ask about it. You actually observe and inspect. You confirm, yeah, they really do it, or yeah, that really does exist. Yes, there really were cameras and locks. Yes, the log says that so-and-so did actually sign in at this time. And can you do it again? Can it be performed again? And also what monitoring there is. So when you look at the guidelines, they take you through this whole thing. First of all, how does it adhere to the standards? How do you plan with this guideline? What in addition about like maybe the availability if it's like for evidence? How do you use this guideline when you're actually doing your audit? And how do you use it when you're reporting, etc.? So these guidelines are really great to help you understand how to actually execute the standards. In addition to the guidelines, we also have the procedures. Now you have to dig down a little bit farther, but for procedures, we can see that they start with a P number. And so we can see that there are different procedures, so like for example, now these of course, they get down much more to the nitty-gritty of the tools and the techniques and the technology. So we could say, okay, well, what is the procedure for assessing risk? And we can go to that very first P1 there. And again, It links to the standards and the guidelines, talks about why we need the procedure, and then it talks about, okay, what is risk? What is this procedure all about? And how do we measure? And what's our methodology? And what's our whole audit approach for this particular procedure? I highly encourage you to go to ACCA's site and look at these. Again, you don't need to memorize them, but you should need to know that they're in place. And what I do is that I have them sort of as a checklist. Have I followed the standard? Have I followed the guideline? Have I followed the procedure? Remember, the standard is mandatory. The guideline helps you achieve your standard. The procedure is down to the actual, much more nitty-gritty of what you actually do. And what are the techniques or the technologies. And so I can see here that risk-based is the risk-based IS audit approach. Gives me some information about that. And then it gives me actual techniques and measurement methods here, and how to collect the data, and how I can actually have auditable units, so to speak. And then it gives me examples and measurements. So I recommend that you go and take a look at these. As we look back on our list here, we can see that there are procedures for risk assessment itself, procedures for digital signatures and intrusion detection, for antivirus and firewalls, and for self-assessment. There are procedures for auditing irregularities and illegal acts, and also for penetration testing itself and vulnerability analysis. And they're not going to say use this particular tool or that particular tool, but they'll say what that tool should do in general and what your output should be. Also, we'll talk about it. They talk about encryption, procedures for encryption, or electronic funds transfer, or change control. So know that we have the standards, the guidelines, and the procedures that are all in place. Now, there is a comprehensive model framework called ITAF. It's the Information Technology Assurance Framework. It is an all-inclusive sort of assurance model that the ACCA has basically put together, as well as the IT Governance Institute. And they talk about IT assurance auditing guidelines and assurance standards used by professionals. Let's take a look at ITAF. You can download the IT Assurance Framework, the ITAF summary document, and it's put out by ACCA. As you can see, we scroll down, we take a look, and they talk about why we even need this, why it's so important. And they talk about it's again, information security, IT security has got to not just be the focus of the technology people. It is the business focus now, because everything we do is online. Everything we do is saved in databases, and there's some kind of transaction that is electronic. And so it's a business problem here. And so we need a common framework of assurance that we have done the best practices possible. So we can download this for free. They talk about it, and they talk about when you're using it in auditing. They talk about how it's organized, and you can see that the assurance framework, there are standards, general performance and reporting. There are guidelines, and then there are tools and techniques, and they go through the whole thing. I recommend you get it. You don't need to memorize it, but in the field you should use it as your frame of reference, along with those standards, guidelines, and procedures. So this is the framework that has been put out by ACCA and ITGI, the IT Governance Institute. So these folks have, like I said, put out that summary that you can get for free. You can get a much more in-depth one if you're willing to pay for that. And the ITAF model basically says, okay, as the auditor, we have these general standards. So they've basically taken all those standards and guidelines we've talked about, put them into one framework, one model. And you'll have not only the standards you adhere to, but also performance standards used to provide auditing and assurance. In other words, is your audit actually producing what we need it to produce? And also reporting standards. So once we actually have done the audit, there are standards for how we actually report our findings. And then, of course, the guidelines. We've taken a look at a little bit of the guidelines. We've looked at all the standards provided to assist us and the tools and techniques, we also took a quick look at the procedures. So realize that all this has been rolled into now this ITAF model that you can download the summary to, and you can also examine all the source that it came from when you go to ACCA's site. We've looked at standards and guidelines and procedures from the auditor's perspective. But remember how I talked about a large part of our job and part of our professional code of ethics is to help educate the stakeholders? There's a tool or a site, or actually a collection of tools, specifically for that, and it's called COBIT. Now we can see that COBIT it was created by ACCA and the IT Governance Institute. It's a best practice model, but it is a best practice model for managers, not so much for auditors. But as auditors, we need to encourage managers to go and use it as a tool. And so it promotes good IT security and control implementations. And again, while we as auditors need to know that it's there, it's really for managers to use IT to support the business. And of course, in that sense, it is related to our job as IS auditors. So looking here at Wikipedia, we can see that COBIT, Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology, COBIT. You don't need to memorize that long, drawn-out name. You just need to know the acronym. And it is for the managers. You can see that it was started in '96. COBIT version 5 has been published just last year by ACCA, and it is for the managers. And there's a little bit of history here, but let's actually go to COBIT's site itself. And we can see that it's the latest edition of ACCA's globally accepted framework for managers. And it talks about the benefits so that we can have high quality information to support our business decisions. We achieve our strategic goals through IT. We achieve operational excellence by through efficient application of technology, etc. And there are a bunch of different things that the managers can download. So when you're in the field, when you're trying to educate those managers, encourage them. They can just get an executive summary, they can get essential facts, they can get introduction, they can get more and more deeper information. But this is the framework for managers to use IT and information systems effectively to support business. And for that reason, we as IS auditors need to know about it and encourage and promote its use. Now, the very next thing we're going to talk about is management of the audit process. All right, we've had some overviews. Now let's talk about managing the audit. You don't just charge in there and start auditing this and that. You actually have someone managing this. And whoever is managing this is not only doing project management, but they're also making sure that the audit is doing what it's supposed to be doing, that it is achieving the objectives laid out for us, that we have sufficient auditors and resources that we can actually do this audit effectively, and that whoever is doing this or that part of the audit, that they're actually competent for that particular part of the audit. So the audit manager has got to make sure that this whole thing is achieved the way it should be and that we are using our people and our resources effectively and properly. One of the first things you need to have is some kind of authority for having this audit. And so the organization that brings in the auditor, the business that is being audited, is going to have an audit committee. Now, the audit committee is generally going to be comprised of people who are not working for the business day to day. They'll be like boards of directors and those kinds of folks, or super senior management. But you have to be careful that the audit committee has its own level of independence, that they are genuinely interested and not trying to hide something. And so that's why we have additional stakeholders and board of directors and a little more outside people who are not directly involved in whatever the activities are. The audit committee has responsibilities. They are there to help on a high level manage risk and make sure that all of the financial reporting and processing is done appropriately. They're there to actually hire us as the auditors. They monitor the control functions, in other words, the things that are used to mitigate risk, be they procedures or technologies or processes. They manage the guidelines. They ensure that the audit job, the audit function itself, supports the objectives, and they develop the audit charter, which we're going to talk about in just a second, and they review the audit activities, and they also review the audit charter. If they're going to hire you as an auditor or an auditing firm, they're going to create this letter of engagement, this engagement letter. And the engagement letter basically says, hey, we need you guys to do an audit within this sort of area. So if we take a look at this sample here, you should know that an engagement letter is basically going to state very clearly what it is that the third party who's doing the auditor, what it is that they're going to do, and the scope and the target areas. So we can see the objective is, we're going to plan an evaluation of da-da-da-da-da. So here's the objective. The scope will be for these systems or for this period of time. The contact information, there's always contact information in the engagement letter. There's always target areas. What are we actually targeting when we audit? Because you don't like audit the whole company. You target something specific, or you target like a specific sort of area or process. And then in accordance with whatever requirements, standards, laws, whatever governance is there. And then here are the team members, and here is the time frame. So this is the engagement letter that we expect the audit committee to come up with when they engage us to do the auditing. Now the charter, here's another thing that they're required to be responsible for. Why are we even doing this audit? Well, there's a mission here to ensure operations are conducted in accordance with higher standards. Who's responsible? Okay, the internal audit is the responsibility of the CFO or the CIO or whoever it is, probably the CFO, but it could also be the CIO as well, the Chief Financial Officer, the Chief Information Officer. And then the roles. So the audit role, the internal audit will coordinate with the external audit. The scope is to review our risk management procedures or whatever it is. You have to clearly state what it is we're auditing. We're not just like looking through dumpsters or something. We're looking for something very specific in a specific scope, a specific area. And then who's responsible? So the audit is responsible for planning and conducting and reporting and following up. So the charter will state all of these things very clearly. Now, common auditing practices. It's very, very common to not only audit using internal people, but also to engage an external third party like PricewaterhouseCoopers, or you as the CISA team. And so very common to engage external folks, which is why we saw the letter of engagement. Very common to use computer-aided auditing tools or auditing techniques, and very common to do, like I'd said before, risk-based auditing. That's really the focus these days, to do risk-based auditing. So that we understand risk. The whole thing is, like, you could be going on forever. So why don't we get to the point? What is it that we're trying to protect? When you do risk-based auditing, the first thing you do is you identify, what are we protecting? Well, we're protecting our data, we're protecting our servers, we're protecting our documentation, we're protecting our people, we're protecting our processes, we're protecting our intellectual property. You need to make sure that management determines what is it that's important to them. What do they have to make their business run? And it's not just going to be the database. It's also going to be people and processes and documentation, and it's going to be their data, and it's going to be their servers and their infrastructure. You get them to determine for this audit, what is it that we are protecting? Now that we have written down what is it that we're protecting, and they should get a group of people together. They should have a committee put together to figure this out. And it shouldn't just be IT people. It should be also managers and IT and all kinds of stakeholders, including mid and lower level managers who really know what it is they need to do their business day to day. So we list what are the things we're protecting. And senior management can prioritize, of course, what's the most important. Then after that, once we know what it is we're protecting, then what are the known threats? And what are the known risks? Okay, and this is where you get a bunch of people together and you think outside the box. I mean, and you're going to spend a couple days on this. What are the risks, or can you imagine risks? I mean, maybe 20 years ago, we never imagined a risk of someone deliberately flying an airplane into a building, right? But you try to imagine, what are all the risks? Well, there are known ones. We get viruses, we get hackers, we get people stealing stuff, we have employee fraud and theft, we have the cleaning crew stealing things, we have accidental information exposure because a salesperson accidentally clicks reply all when it should have been selective. And some of these are honest risks and honest mistakes, and some of them are malicious, and some of them are environmental. Well, we're in an earthquake zone, we're in a flood zone, we're in a hurricane zone, we're in a this, we're in a that. We're at risk because of, well, maybe our whole financial district will get flooded because of some hurricane. Maybe we're close to an airport, and so there can be incidents at the airport that cause things. So you get people to just totally think outside the box, list every possible risk. Don't bother prioritizing anything, just brain bust it out. Just everybody think of any possible, no matter how crazy, what's the risk? Well, there's a risk of solar flares shutting down satellites, which cut our communications. I mean, think of everything, okay? Then what you do, you have a list of everything you're trying to protect, every possible imaginable risk to those things, and then you start prioritizing. Okay, what are the things that are the most important that we've got to be looking at? And you assign, and there are two ways of approaching this. You either assign a level of probability and impact, or you assign a dollar value. And you can go either way. Sometimes you can't quantify with dollar value, so instead you say, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, the probability that this will happen, a virus infection, is 9, and the impact is 2. And so therefore, 9 times 2 on a scale of 100, this is a risk of 18. And you give this, or you say, you know, if we have a virus, some kind of virus attack, it takes us half a day to clean and we lose X number of dollars. So you either qualify or quantify the value of the risk. And that helps you prioritize what is the most important to focus your time and effort on. At some point, you draw a line and you say, okay, these risks are worth it. The rest of them are so unlikely, they'll just fall below the threshold. We'll call that residual risk, and we'll just have sort of like a general blanket plan for things that are highly unlikely to happen, or things that are so far out of our control that we can't protect against that. Like we can't protect against solar flares. But what we can do is we can have a contingency. So whenever you have that residual risk, you just have a contingency, and it can be like, well, either we back up and restore, or we work somewhere else, or how do we just keep our business going? And we'll talk about those contingencies when we talk about business continuity and disaster recovery. But anyway, you've identified what you're protecting, you've identified all of the potential risks. You've either assigned a dollar value to the risk based on what you know or what would happen. If the server was stolen, that's $30,000 plus X amount of software plus man hours plus, and don't be afraid, and you should include soft cost as well as hard cost. So like what are the man hours to get this thing functioning again? If you can't quantify it with dollars, then you do like a probability and an impact on a scale of 10. Probability 5 on a scale of 10, 10 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. Impact 5, so therefore on a scale of 100, this risk is worth 25. And you lay it all out so you know what should be your highest priority, what should you be targeting. And so when we talk about risk, we're talking about these threats could be anything: improper access, former employees, data theft, but it could be all kinds of stuff: environmental, lightning strikes, dust. Like when I worked in Africa, extremely high risk was the dust. I mean, dust got into everything, and the dust also had such a high iron content that we actually would have rust forming on circuit boards and destroying circuit boards. That was a risk that existed in that location. Couldn't get around it because there was no way to keep it out. We couldn't, in those facilities, maintain a clean room environment. So our mitigation was, don't buy super expensive stuff and realize we have to replace it maybe every 2-3 years, and that was our risk mitigation. So you identify what you're protecting. You identify all of the imaginable risks. You qualify or quantify the cost or the value of the risk. And at some point you have a cutoff line, and everything below that is residual. You can't do anything about it. So therefore, what's your contingency? And that is risk-based approach to auditing. Now that we've identified the risks, the next thing we need to do is see, are there controls in place to mitigate the risk, and are those controls being implemented properly? So the next thing we'll talk about is controls. Well, we've talked about risk and controls. Let's talk about planning for that audit. Remember how I said you don't just go charging right in there and checking things. You're going to some degree, disrupt the business's operations. So you need to plan so that you can do things as effectively and as efficiently as possible, maximizing your time, their time, the resources you have. Planning so that, well, if they can only get things, maybe records out of storage at a certain time, that you're prepared for that. So you have to plan, and the planning needs to involve the cooperation of the managers whose departments you are auditing. So when we talk about planning, first thing is that management confirms that this is what we're trying to accomplish. These are the objectives of the audit. And remember that we had the audit committee that has the letter of engagement and the audit charter, which basically says, what are we doing, who's doing it, why, what are we trying to protect, who's responsible, all of that sort of stuff. So we have our objectives clearly stated. We have the standards that we can go to ACCA's site and use as sort of a checklist to compare our planning against. We also know that ACCA provides us with the procedures and the guidelines, and they have loads of other resources too. So we've got all of that in place, and we confirm with management that we have all of this, and realize that when you're auditing, you have the audit management as well as the client that you're management that you're auditing as well. So once we have that, the audit charter is done, it's distributed, and now we're creating the plan. And we may create a short-term and a long-term plan. Now the difference is, short-term is, what are we going to accomplish in 1 year? I mean, I know it seems like a lot, but you've got a large organization that's very busy trying to get stuff done. They plan months and months, a year in advance. And so you can't just say, well, in 2 weeks. You got to give them a fair amount of time to comply. And you've probably seen in cases where there have been large things like HIPAA, well, years were given to organizations to comply, simply because it just takes a while to move something that big into all of their processes. So what are we going to do within a year? That's our short-term planning. And then long-term planning, are we doing any auditing that is going to be directed at something that's much bigger, that's going to take more than a year? Is it going to have a much bigger impact on the overall IT strategy and the IT environment of the organization that we're auditing? And now, who is going to do what when we plan for our audit? First thing is, we of course need to know the business mission. And when we know the business mission, we'll know whether or not their controls and their whole sort of framework for minimizing risk is in line with their business. And so we have to determine what the requirements are for how they process information. We have to ask to see all their policies and any standards they have. There may be industry standards, there may be company standards, as well as ACCA standards and other standards. There may be government standards. So we need to see all their policies, all their standards, and all the standards and policies that are relevant and regulations that are relevant to them. And then we have to do the risk analysis so that we know what we're targeting, and the risk analysis should support what it is that we're auditing. And then we have to look at what are all of the internal controls, have to know the scope and the objectives of the audit. The objective of the audit might simply be it might be very, very specific. It might be to determine, is our method of writing software sufficient, and do we do enough tests on it so that we have reasonable assurance that the software is reasonably safe? So it could be really, really specific, or it could be really broad, like we're going to look at all your books. So, we have to define what is the scope and the objectives, and that's something that when management hires you, that's what they're stating. So you need to know what are your objectives, what's the scope. And then, of course, how are we going to approach it? And who's going to do what? And personnel, resources, and logistics. Well, we need one person who can pen test the servers. We need another person who can check code. We need another person who will interview different people. And you have to look at different people with their different kinds of strengths. So like, you probably wouldn't take the folks who are going to be hardcore looking at lines of code. They probably don't have the same skill set as people who know how to chat people up and get people to describe what they do. Because you got to realize, folks, when you go into audit, you're going to be viewed with suspicion, at best, resentment probably. And so you're going to need to send in your most skillful people when it comes to actually chatting with people to just chat generally with them, while at the same time being professional and respectful and mindful of the fact that you can't waste their whole day. You need to get the information you need. Obviously, you need to be able to be firm when you need to look at logs or records, and that's why you need the charter to give you the authority to do whatever, to request whatever you need to request, and it has to come from the highest level. So when you plan, you need to determine all of these things as part of your plan, so that you know ahead of time, okay, today we're going to go after these things. Tomorrow we're going to go after those things. And also, at the end of the day, you should always have a debrief. The project manager, whoever the audit manager is, and everybody gets together, okay, did you achieve this, this, this? I had a checklist. No, I wasn't able to. They weren't able to get this out of storage. So-and-so was sick today, whatever. Okay, we'll roll these into tomorrow. And the project manager, the audit manager, has to be on top of all this to know that you'll be done with your audit in 2 weeks or whatever your audit period is, or 3 days or whatever your time period is. Obviously, you have to be looking at what laws and regulations are relevant to that industry, and are they in compliance? So we need to determine, are there any external requirements? Do they deal with health informatics, where they're going to fall under things like HIPAA? Do they deal with finances, where they're going to fall under things like SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley? So what are the laws and regulations required? And are there any external requirements when creating policies and standards and procedures? Well, SOX requires that that the company have due diligence. And so did they do due diligence by creating a policy and training people to whatever was appropriate to them? So you need to also understand this industry. And then through the planning process, we start by understanding the business and its environment itself. If you're used to auditing one type of business, like maybe health, you're not going to be taking a senior position that's technical when you're auditing like nuclear facilities. You'll have skill sets that can be used, but we have to analyze the business. We have to understand what risks are relevant to them, and that's where you also need people who understand this industry and the management you work with to identify the risks, and then you develop whatever your audit program will be. So this is all stuff that you plan in advance, and you don't do it in just one meeting or just a couple days. And so once we have our planning, we must remember that everything we do in the audit needs to achieve an objective. So the big thing is that ultimately, everything that we're looking at, we have to see if all these processes, these IT technologies, these operational procedures, do they support the organizational goals, the business mission set by higher management? That's really what we're looking for. And are there internal controls in place to minimize the risk? And we need to verify that we're not overlooking any regulatory requirements or legal requirements. Make sure that those are all fulfilled. So these are objectives when we're doing our audit. Now, when you do the audit, there are different kinds of audits. Obviously, there's financial audit, where let me see your books, let me see your invoices, let me make sure that your financial statements are complete and accurate. and that you haven't been cooking the books or hiding anything, or simply we think there's supposed to be tons of receivables. How come we didn't, we're down 20% and yet we've had all this business? Well, let's audit and find out what happened. Oh, well, we let invoices go so far out that people lost track of them. So there's financial audits. There's operational audits, and operational audits really are there day-to-day controls in place to make sure that the business is running the way it should. And there are many large firms that will do an IT audit before they do a financial audit, because you figure if you aren't maintaining the integrity of the data, how can you have a good financial audit? So we can have that. An integrated audit is basically both. Do we have day-to-day controls in place, and how well do they protect the books? The administrative audit is basically how is the organization running in general? And so are there management policies in place to make sure that people follow whatever they're supposed to follow? And then there's, of course, the very specific technical IS audits. So, okay, we did a vulnerability scan and a pen test, and we did a port scan, and we checked for weak passwords, and we checked for open access points and that kind of thing. Specialized tends to be if you're engaging an external party, a third party, to manage some of your controls. Let's audit that. Let's audit them. Let's audit their effectiveness in controlling your assets. So like, for example, if you're going to move a bunch of data or process to the cloud, let's audit that. Let's audit how well those folks who are managing the cloud, managing your software as a service, infrastructure as a service, whatever, how well are they protecting your data, your assets, your functionality? And then finally, there's forensic auditing. Let's figure out what happened. Some major event. Okay, let's piece together all the things that led up to this, and let's find the root cause. And so that's forensic. So there are all these different types of audits, and you're not necessarily going to do all of them. You'll probably zoom in on one or two. Maybe you'll do an operational or an integrated where you first check the controls and then someone else checks the finances. So different types of audits. So to kind of look at all of this, when we're planning for an audit, we have to determine, is our plan going to be short-term, 1 year, or long-term? More than that, because this is a much bigger thing we're looking at. And we may have to plan for both. Are there any laws or regulations that they may or may not be aware of? We have to do a business analysis. We have to do a full risk analysis, and we have to develop this full audit program. We're looking for controls. Based on our whole planning process, we need to know what are the objectives and the scope of the audit and what type of audit is it. And then finally, we have this plan together. We communicate the plan with management of the folks who are hiring us. So with that, we have the audit planning process. The very next thing we're going to talk about is the methodology. Well, we've talked about planning. Let's now talk about methodology. You have done all the work really up front to plan. Now just implement. First thing in your methodology, you've got that charter, and you're going to have a document. You're going to have a methodology document that basically contains program information. The program information is just, okay, what are we trying to accomplish, and how far are we going to go? Scope and objectives. And that is communicated to all of your team members who are doing the audit. You've already allocated the resources, you've communicated your whole plan, you've gotten, at least in theory, cooperation from everybody. So you have a document and you say, okay team, you do this, you do this, you do this, and we'll connect together tonight and we'll debrief, see how we did. So we start with our methodology document. And then we have our work program, and this is basically based on our strategy and our plan. Our whole plan is we're going to pen test the network, we're going to do a vulnerability scan on the servers, we're going to make sure that people are following procedure in terms of locking workstations, we're going to make sure that passwords are complex, we're going to make sure that people are changing passwords, we're going to make sure that there aren't any accounts that are 3 years old and no one's been there. And so we have just a very clear sort of document on what we're trying to do, our whole approach. Okay, you have the best sort of method with people, so you're going to chat people up a bit and just find out How many people are tailgating? Are they propping open the server room door? Has anybody been getting into the telecom room or whatever? And so we've got this whole strategy and plan that we are now implementing. The whole process, we've planned for it already. We know what it is that we're auditing, the subject. We know our objectives. And the objectives, again, are based on what is management trying to accomplish. And we're going to help them find out whether or not they are accomplishing it. We know the scope. It's only this town. It's only this department. It's only this process. It's only this It's only this particular set of servers. It's only something very specific. We have our plan together. Now we start gathering data. We go through our whole methodology. We start asking. We look at logs. We do our pen testing if that's part of it. We look at procedures. We start with, may I see your policy? May I see any procedures and any documents that you have people follow? And we look and see, where are the procedures posted? Do people know? Are they being trained? Once we've gathered all of this data, and the data will be evidence, and it can be evidence of compliance or non-compliance, then we evaluate. And remember, we're gathering facts and we're providing an informed opinion, but our informed opinion is always substantiated by very clear, hard evidence. And then once we have all of that, we communicate our findings and our result and our recommendations, and we have our report, which is our deliverable. And it will probably also include some follow-up, maybe in 3 months or 6 months or 1 year's time. As you're doing this, you will be on the lookout for fraud. You should be. Remember how we talked about going in with some professional skepticism. You don't take anyone's word for it they're doing something. You actually go and you watch them. And you try to watch them in a way that they haven't had time to like clean up their act before you walk in the door, kind of thing. And so you have to realize that chances are very good you'll uncover, if not just people cutting corners or just honestly not doing something the way they should be because they didn't know, that they weren't trained, or whatever the procedure was wasn't disseminated properly, but also actually people deliberately trying to hide things, or two employees colluding together, collusion, where they're acting together. So you will be looking at this. Now, when you come across this is where you have to be extremely professional. You need to report that to management. You need to gather material evidence of the fraud, and it's up to management to determine what the fraud mechanisms could be, but you may discover them, and you must provide due care when performing this work, because if you're going to say, yeah, I saw people stealing this or whatever, or I see evidence of it, it's just got to be just the facts. You've got to provide just the facts, and you may hear all kinds of gossip, and it's good to hear gossip because it can alert you to things. You need to also realize that you have to have material evidence to substantiate gossip, because who knows why people are gossiping. They could have all sorts of their own agendas. But then again, you could have people gossiping and it's something really going on that management isn't aware of or actually trying to play down. So realize that there will be fraud detection in your work, and as you do that, as you're aware of that, you need to collect substantial material evidence to support what you've seen, and it is just the facts. So with that, for conducting your audit, we start out, we had the plan, we reviewed the whole plan with management, we got them to agree to cooperate with us. We determine how we're going to approach this, and again, there's no one set way because there's no one style of business. Which individuals should you interview? What department policy standards and guidelines should you be looking at? You want to look at all of them if you can, and identify ones that you were not able to look at. Identify the tools or methods. So I used this particular pen test tool and this particular port scanner, and I reviewed logs, and so you identify exactly how you did stuff. And once you've got all that, you evaluate all of your findings. You document all of the activities that produce the results. You gather any evidence that you need, and you then create your report, and you communicate the report to the right people, and then if necessary, you have a follow-up. So that is conducting the audit in general. Now remember, ACCA has those guidelines and those procedures. You can look at those, and they're very specific ones. I mean, they go very, very deep and very specific for very specific types of audits. So depending upon the audit you're doing, you can look that up on ACCA's site. Some of them you do have to be a member to actually to get a copy of. And so anyway, follow these things. The next thing we're going to take a look at is the evidence itself. All right, we've talked about how we can conduct our audit. Now let's talk about gathering evidence. Remember how I said when we are auditing, if we are going to provide a report and say these things are out of compliance with company policy, regulation, or what you expect or what you're trying to do, we have to have evidence that shows, that proves that this is the case. And we gather the evidence so that we can substantiate what our final assessment is. So when we talk about gathering evidence, there are actually a number of ways to gather evidence. And we can see here that evidence can be gathered just by watching, just by observing, by talking to people and the notes from our interview, by looking at the documentation itself. Well, according to the documentation, people should be doing it this way with these steps. Well, I observed it's that way. And when I spoke to people, it's even another way. Looking at contracts. Okay, in order to provide whatever level of service, your contract states that it should be this, this, and this. Well, I observed that, that, and that. And also any other agreements besides just purely contracts. Also, the results of procedures. So these are different ways of gathering evidence. Now, remember, we talked about earlier that evidence must be relevant. So there's a concept called materiality. Materiality is how significant is this breach, misstatement? Is it very significant? What kind of impact does it have? What is its level of materiality? We're interested in collecting evidence that has materiality to it. And so we're looking for how significant is the error in the procedure, the process, the system, the job function, the organization, because it needs to have some substance to it. Now, evidence, when we collect evidence, it can go through a whole life cycle, and you should be aware of the life cycle. And you should also be aware that evidence needs to be preserved and handled and documented properly, or it may not be admissible if it comes down to going to court. So the first thing with evidence is that we discover and recognize that, hey, this is evidence. We collect it and we protect it. And if it's really material evidence, like if you're looking for like outright fraud and criminal activity, you'll have to follow a whole procedure. It'll have to be bagged and tagged, and 2 people are there, and there's always a log of who's in possession of it, and it's sealed in a way that it can't be tampered with, etc. So we have to protect it. We have to record the fact that we have it with complete descriptions. We collect it. We identify it. We store and preserve it. The main thing is you want to make sure that nothing happens to the evidence, because if it's been tampered with, then it's no good. As we transport it, we have to make sure that it's securely transported, and there's handoffs with logs and everything. So there's no question, there's no like, well, there were a couple hours we can't account for because the evidence was laying in an open door, in a room with an open door or something. And then we will possibly present the evidence in court, and then we may return it. Now, in the case of computer evidence, one of the things you're going to run into is you may have to confiscate a server. I mean, well, law enforcement will probably do it for you, but there will be cases where this computer is evidence, and people go, I can't function without it. I need this server to do whatever. So it kind of depends. If it's not so criminal, then possibly the evidence you can collect can be a copy of a drive, or it can be a copy of processes or whatever, so that the business can keep on working with the original. Or sometimes it can't be. Sometimes you take the original evidence. So it just kind of depends on how the degree of criminality, we should say. So anyway, the evidence can go through this whole life cycle, and it's up to you to make sure that it is gathered properly, documented properly, preserved properly, not tampered with, and potentially then ultimately returned. Now, the gathering techniques, we talked earlier about gathering techniques. So we can review procedures, we can review documentation, we can review standards. Mostly we're looking at what do you have in place already? What do you have written? Anything from contracts to procedures to manuals to what are people really doing? And we'll interview, we'll observe, we'll look at the results. Okay, so you say that you're producing 20,000 widgets a day. How come when they do an inventory there's only 15,000? Now let me go and see why. And it may not be fraud at all. It could just be that now we see in our automated system there's a glitch in the counting mechanism. And so we will interview people and we'll observe. And we'll observe performance, we'll observe procedures and process and how people conduct their daily work. Now, when we talk about testing, there's two kinds of approaches. There's compliance and substantive. With compliance testing, you're really looking to see are controls in place and are they verifying that the controls are there. And so you'll probably do three things. You'll probably first just chat up the person and say, hey, what do you do in your job? Okay. And then you'll see if there are any controls in place and are they adhering to it. And so you'll just chat and you'll verify that yes, there are controls in place for people logging on, entering, closing doors, starting up equipment or whatever. And then once you know that there are controls in place, you can then drill down into that control and see, is that control really working? Is that procedure or counting system or software or hardware or device really doing its job? And that's substantive testing. We're looking to see substantially if that control is functioning as it should be. So we have the two testing methods. Now, evidence can be really reliable and really useful, and it can be just junk. And so the factors that make it more reliable, first of all, how independent is the evidence? Did it come from an independent source? If it comes from someone within the department with an axe to grind, then it's not very independent. But if it came from a third-party vendor who said, yes, I have this, or from another auditor, or from someone who's not involved in that department or that company or that process, the more independent the source, the more reliable the evidence is. Also, what were the qualifications of the person who gave it to you? Like, if I get evidence from a doctor talking about some clinical procedure, to me, that person has much more qualification than somebody who is not a doctor talking, maybe it's an accountant or a plumber talking about a clinical procedure. That person doesn't have the same level of qualification. So what was the level of expertise and qualification of the person who provided it? So did the evidence come from an independent source? That makes it very much more reliable. Did it come from a qualified person with a certain level of expertise? Did they know what they're talking about? Also, how objective is this evidence? And when did this evidence come about? I mean, if this is from 10 years ago, it had better be about a case that's relevant 10 years ago, as opposed to we're trying to find out why this week the production line didn't produce 20,000 widgets. We don't want to look necessarily at 5-year-old data. So we're looking at the independence, the qualification of the person who produced it, the objectivity of it, and also the timeline. Always the chain of evidence. Whenever you collect evidence, there's always got to be a very clear, like I had said before, chain of ownership. There can't be any gaps. Like we can't say, well, we don't know where this evidence sat or who handled it for a 24-hour period. It's got to be very clear that this evidence could not have been tampered with along the way. So a very clear chain of ownership. Now, for common rules of evidence, make sure that the evidence is reliable. Make sure that it is relevant. Make sure it's been well preserved. Make sure that it was properly documented and identified, and of course, is it legally permissible? In the case of computer evidence is considered hearsay because it's so easy to falsify and tamper. Computer evidence can be considered to be corroborating evidence for expert witness testimony. And so you realize that just because I found it on someone's computer, that alone by itself, that could have been placed by somebody. It could be, I could have created it. So computer evidence by itself is considered at the same level as hearsay evidence. And at best, it is corroborative evidence for expert witness testimony. In computer forensics, we're trying to find out what happened. Not necessarily even that it was some criminal activity, not always. We're just trying to figure out what on earth happened. Let's look at the software. Where did it break down? Where did the system break down? How did the hackers get in? Where did the network break down? So we're looking for, we're looking at the software, but we also will probably take a look at the system itself. We might even copy the drive. We'll probably even capture the running processes before we just simply unplug the machine, because we want to see what processes are running. We'll also look at the network traffic itself. Let's see what traffic came along on the network. And then at that point, once we've captured it, we'll probably, once we know that we've captured all the running processes, we'll shut down the system then and then preserve it so no one can go in and wipe out the hard drive or tamper with timestamps. So when we do computer forensics, and you have to, if you're going to do this and you're going to take people to court, you have to treat it like a crime scene. You take pictures and you bag it up. Don't do this yourself. Get law enforcement, get somebody who is highly qualified, and because if it's just you doing it, people could cry that it was mishandled and that there wasn't a good chain of ownership. So make sure that you handle computer evidence very, very carefully, and you defer that to someone who, law enforcement or whoever who's qualified. That's, of course, if you're going to court. If you're not going to court and you're just trying to find out what happened, then you're probably best served by copying the drive, looking at running processes, dumping that all out. There are plenty of tools that you can look at on the internet that will do that for you. They'll copy out via a USB port, a serial port, or whatever, to capture the state of the machine as it is at that moment. Now there's this concept called sampling. If we're trying to look at hundreds of thousands of transactions, we can't look at it every one. We just can't. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a sample that's representative of the whole population. And the reason why is because we just don't have the time. Of course, obviously, the larger the sample, the more precise it will be, the more representative it'll be. So when we do sampling, we use a smaller subset of a larger group to get knowledge. We can do statistical sampling where we can say, well, we checked 10% of the total population. We looked at 10% of the transactions and we found X. Or we can do non-statistical. You might say, you know what, I don't need to just across the board look at 10%. I, as an auditor, know that the most likely place will be right there, so I'm just going to go right there. So that's non-statistical. You use your own judgment. Different sampling methods. We can say, okay, just look at 10%, 20%, 5%, whatever, fixed sample size. Or just go until you find something and you don't need to go any farther. We found it, stop and go. We don't need to go any farther. Or discovery. Look a lot deeper because there might be some very small instances of fraud. They might fall under your normal radar, but look really deeply. Or we might do something called a variable method. Don't just look at all the population. Look at the thing created by the night shift versus the things created by the day shift, where you stratify. You look at a smaller subset and then you evaluate those smaller subsets. Or you could just say, no, everything that was created by all shifts last week. Or you can look at the difference. You can say, okay, unaudited, supposedly 20,000 widgets came out. But when I did the audit, only 15,000 widgets came out. So you look at that difference. So these are all different ways of going about doing sampling. So when you collect your samples, obviously you establish the objectives. You decide what is the population, in other words, the thing you're sampling. What is our method? We talked about them earlier. How big is the sample size? We'll do 10%, random. We'll then select our audit sample, we'll do the audit and then we'll evaluate the results. So that is how we gather evidence. The next thing is, what do we do once we have all of these results? You've gathered the evidence, you're forming opinions. Now, the final output of your audit is a report that you give to upper management or whoever basically hired you to audit so that they can figure out what to do. You're going to give them recommendations. So as we're preparing to do our post-audit control evaluation, we are going to review the evidence. We're trying to verify if the controls, the policies, procedures, technical, whatever's, software, hardware, physical, environmental, whatever they put in place, are functioning. Are they effective? Are they meeting business objectives? I mean, that's really the bottom line. Do they have controls, and are they meeting business objectives? And are they being implemented effectively or properly? Or are they just not meeting the objectives? And we report on these strengths and the weaknesses. Now, a report can be just a few pages, or it can be hundreds of pages. It really depends upon what you were auditing and the depth to which you're expected to report. But they all have some commonalities. They'll all have some kind of introduction with an executive summary. They'll have the findings, they'll have conclusions, they'll have determinations, and then they'll have detailed lists. Let's actually go take a look at some sample reports, just so we can kind of see them for ourselves here. This is the Global Information Assurance, and we'll take a look at this one here. This example, this is an example certification paper, and so we can see this is actually a sample of a very specific audit, and we can see that there's a table of contents. It has an executive summary. This is what we did. This is what the potential vulnerabilities were. These are our recommended actions, short-term, medium-term, long-term. Then we specifically looked at physical security, network security. We looked at disaster recovery and backup. So we specifically looked at these administrative procedures, use of root privilege or admin privilege, and how that was secured. And so then we can see all of the details. And when we go farther, we can see that there were appendices on here were the objectives for the controls and the audit guidelines. Here were some printer vulnerabilities we were looking at. This next one was writable files exceptions, additional file recommendations. So then it goes through, and here's our executive summary. We did this at this date. We were looking for these specific things. We had these specific objectives. We were looking at formal and non-formal security procedures and policies, and to ensure that contractors, employees, visitors all adhered to the specified policy. We were looking at physical security, network security, and security in individual servers. And there's a little bit of background there. Our procedure was outlined in Appendix A. We used, based on our scope of objectives, and we also used some network scanning tools. We saw these particular potential vulnerabilities, and we have these recommended actions. And so then the rest of this goes through exactly what they did, how they did it, and in detail. And they will even have some diagrams, a network diagram, and going further on describing they have a description of their perimeter hosts and the scanner that they used and what they scanned and what they were looking at. So here is an example of a very specific report. Here's another example produced by a different organization, and it's written maybe a little more formally. The Customer Information Security Audit Report. We're going to scroll down a little bit here. So we can see the acknowledgments here, who are the authors and the reviewers and the publisher. Let's go down a little bit farther, take a look at the executive summary. We see here the table of contents. It starts with the executive summary, which is what it should have, showing the core assets and the risks. Remember how we talked about we're identifying what it is we're protecting and what are the risks to that. Also, what is management's knowledge and awareness? Because remember, if we don't have support from the very top, this just isn't going to work. And also a summary of the primary security threats. Remember how we talked about identifying, once you know what you're protecting and the risks, well then what is the threat level with those various risks? And then we have compiled recommendations, the scope of how much we audited, the methodology that we used, and how we scored the risk, and then our whole approach, and then the findings about specific things. So we have findings about the current security policy, how the Information Security Department was organized, how they're managing assets, how they're doing HR security, basically what are they doing? Are they training people? What security awareness are they giving folks? Physical and environmental security, communications and operations management, access control, information system acquisition, development, and maintenance. Okay, so did you write some programs? How did you buy these things? How did you evaluate them? How did you put them into production? How did you maintain them? And how did you manage security incidents and business continuity? And what is your compliance level? So this particular report is a lot more formal, a lot more formally structured, and it has all the elements that we talked about earlier. This is your deliverable, folks. This is the end thing that you're trying to produce. But ultimately, what you're really trying to do is give management something to act on. And you're working with management, and you're working with the teams, and you're working with them so that they can do business the best possible way. And that's really your job, not to just go barging in and saying, you're doing something wrong. You're there to help them. And you need to make sure they understand that. Now, very often, it is the case that upper management, they're trying to hide something, or they don't believe, or they've hired you to prove something that isn't true. I mean, that happens all the time. And your professionalism is required when dealing with that kind of thing. And it's not for you to make judgments except to come to conclusions based on what you find. And then it's really totally up to that management, your client, to do something about it. However, you might also be expected to come back in 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, whatever, to see, are they in compliance? You might have been hired by someone to go and double check, go back in 6 months and see if those department managers have implemented what you recommend. So our audit report is going to have those things, the introduction with the summary, the findings, the conclusions, what we determined, and the detailed findings as well. In our documentation, of course, we developed the documentation at the end, but that was based on how we started this whole thing, our whole planning. And everything that we do is supported by and supports the evidence and conclusions made in the report. We have to support with evidence what our conclusions are. And the documentation, of course, should be stored safely. You shouldn't just be lying it around, having it lie around. It should be locked up. It should be delivered carefully. Very often, you'll deliver a printed copy, not an electronic copy, and it's the only one, or whatever else is stored very safely and securely. So the components of the audit documentation, as we talked about, what was our strategy? What did we do? And what was our planning? We'll have our observations and our notes, and how did we do this? Were there any laws and regulations involved? What were the activities we did, and what did we find? Did we use any external services? What are our follow-up activities? And conclusions and recommendations all finally put into this report that we hand whoever hired us, basically, upper management. Once we're done with the audit, our post-audit tasks, we have the assessment of the findings, we talk with management, we show it to them. Here's our review, and we have our exit interview, and we may, of course, have some provision to come back as well. When you report, you got to realize that they're not necessarily going to want to hear what you have to say. Or they hired you to say something that isn't true. That happens a lot. When you are sharing the reports, here's where you got to have your most tactful people work with people. Sometimes you have to kind of negotiate with them to get them to be willing to accept the bad news. You know, the old saying, you can catch more flies with honey than vinegar, you know. So it takes tact, it takes professional courtesy. You realize that this is the part they don't want to hear, that the part that they were hoping would be something different. Sometimes you have to kind of negotiate with them to get them to understand, and you have to work with them. Sometimes you're facilitating between management and the department, and you're helping management and the department come to an understanding on how to improve process, and you're the facilitator. Sometimes you're just plain old doing conflict resolution. So this is where it takes a lot of people skills and a lot of professionalism. So just realize that if you're the project manager planning this, you're going to take your most senior, your most people-oriented person and to basically deliver the results. Now, the folks who are going to get your report, they're going to be the senior management who hired you, the key stakeholders, the board of directors, whoever, your own audit management, the audit committee members, the folks who first wrote up the charter and the engagement letter, probably comprised of board members, and whatever managers manage the whole audit activity. Those are going to be the recipients of your audit report. It is ultimately up to them to do something about your findings. Now, you may indeed have follow-ups. You may have to come and see if corrective actions were taken based on your recommendations, and probably you will be involved in follow-up. Now, how to communicate the issues and the risks and the results? Obviously, you need to be able to present all the evidence and the findings in a sort of even, non-judgmental, just straight facts, this is what we found, professional sort of manner. And that means you need to be very clear on all the evidence and the findings. You have your detailed report. You, if necessary, there are any post-audit tasks, so you conduct a findings assessment, a findings review, your exit interview, which we talked about earlier. You communicate the results to the individuals specified in the audit charter, because it should say up front who's going to receive these results, and possibly develop your follow-up program. The last thing we're going to look at in this lesson is how we can help empower the folks we've audited to improve their own process without just simply coming in like a policeman or something and saying, you did these things. We're going to talk about control self-assessment. We've reported our findings. Now, let's see how we can get the employees and the client that we're auditing themselves to help with this process. There's a new initiative, something called Control Self-Assessment, CSA, and you're basically involving the folks that you're auditing or the processes that you're auditing or the departments that you're auditing. You're involving them in the process. And I got to tell you, there are loads of advantages to involving folks and empowering them because they'll take ownership and they'll be able to tell you stuff that they see day in and day out, stuff that you're not going to see, but they're there all the time, so they'll see it. So when we talk about control self-assessment, it does maintain internal control security. It utilizes the employees really, it leverages them really well. And it allows employees to report on control functions and potential risks. When you do it, you as the IS auditor, you're there as a facilitator. You're coming in as a lead with your expertise. You're going to take them through the process. Basically the same process you went through, but you say, you get them to help you determine, okay, what is it you're protecting? Management wants this. What are the risks? What do you see? And you take them through the whole process there with you as the facilitator. And all of this supports the whole control self-assessment, the CSA initiative, and it supports management as well because you've got employee buy-in in the whole thing. Now the tools that you'll use are employee questionnaires, employee surveys and ratings sheets, regular management meetings. You'll also have team meetings that you'll facilitate. And you can use that for discovery. Don't just ask the managers, ask the people who are actually doing it. Get team meetings going that you facilitate because you'll discover all kinds of things. Facilitate workshops. Now realize that there are some limitations to this. I mean, the whole idea is to help transfer the monitoring to the people who are there day in and day out. And there are many benefits, like because they're there, the risk prevention and the early detection, much better than if you were there after the fact or only for a 2-week period. The team building becomes very effective. There's improved communication with management, and also it helps cut down on the cost of monitoring controls and control assessment. The downside is management might think that this is a good substitute for auditing in general. It's not. It's a supplement, because you still need that third-party, impartial person coming in who's not part of the day-to-day operations to be able to see things that everybody else is not noticing. So this is a supplement to it. Another problem is that management has to make sure that this is worked into people's tasks as part of their normal job, not just another burden laid on top of them. Because if it just suddenly comes in out of the blue, they'll view it as extra work. And also you need to consider the feedback you get from folks. Not all of it is something that is viable or that you can afford. So management has to make it very clear that while all feedback is taken and accepted gladly and gratefully, it may not be practical or within the budget or realistic or this or that or the other or within the business objectives to implement every suggestion, even if it's a good suggestion. So management has to set that expectation. But if people feel like they're being heard, and if people feel like they're contributing, they will really help a lot. I mean, that does so much to improve employee morale and morale of the people working in the department. So these are the benefits and the challenges. And the employees and the managers, they're key. Also, you'll use technology a lot. You'll use it to collect, store, collate, and analyze all the data that you collect from your employees and from the participants. Now let's talk about something called continuous auditing. Auditing is something that hopefully is something that is not just done like once every 6 months. It's something that you're continuously monitoring. If you're a network administrator, systems administrator, you know what it means to continuously monitor performance of a system or a network. If you are a manager, you know what it means to continuously monitor the performance and the output of your team or your department. Auditing needs to be continuous as well. And so we should have auditing tasks that are performed continuously, and this allows businesses to just in real time almost see what's going on and not find out about it 6 months later and now how do we deal with it because it's so long gone and we've lost all this money. So for continuous auditing components, we have this concept called continuous data assurance, CDA, and these are, do we have mechanisms in place to review and verify that we have correct information? Can we tell in real time that information is correct? And then there's continuous control monitoring, so it's data assurance and it's the control monitoring. We know that the data, we can at any moment take a look at the data and feel confident that it's correct and complete, and we can look at it in real time. For control monitoring, do we have mechanisms that help us assure that the internal controls are there, doing their job, helping reduce or mitigate the risk of fraud and other threats while meeting regulatory requirements? So we will continuously monitor data and continuously monitor our controls. This gives us continuous assurance when both of these are working in place, functioning independently of each other, that we are meeting our overall business objectives. Remember how we talked about different kinds of auditing, and we talked about you can have a financial audit, you can have an operational audit. Very frequently, you'll do that integrated audit. Now, you as an IS person may not be involved necessarily with the financial side, but you might be involved with, yes, the database is good. Yes, the data has integrity. No, nobody tampered with it. Yes, it's remaining confidential, so that the financial audit can be done with a level of assurance as well. So the integrated auditing process is, like we said before, we'll identify the risks. What are the controls that are in place? Let's take a look at the controls. How are they designed? Let's make sure that they're being supported properly. Let's test them and let's report the results. So when we are supporting the implementation of risk management and control practice, we want to, as the IS auditor, support this and hopefully use the control self-assessment as an ancillary to support our own auditing, our own independent third-party auditing. And we want to have continuous auditing in place as much as possible so that at any given moment, the company can be confident about its operations and its data and what it's producing. So that is lesson 1. In lesson 2, we're going to talk about something called IT governance.